Thank you for the nice introduction, Magnus. I'll not be talking about visions or any blue sky dreams or whatever. Probably, if you look into the title, I'm having the 5G use cases of massive MTC and also reliable low latency communication requirements and technologies. It will probably be the most boring presentation during this event, and I will actually talk a lot about technologies and numbers rather than visions. So I think all the hype about 5G started for almost 5 years ago. And I think we have had an excellent time. We could dream because not anything was exact. So whatever we came up with could be correct in 5G. But now we are in this sad situation. We have started actually to standardize 5G. So we start actually to become realistic. So that's how boring it will be in my presentation. So I think after all this dream period of almost 5 years, the industry have come to some consensus that we can somewhat divide the use cases in 3 domains. The first one is enhanced mobile broadband. It's a lot about making the network faster, low latency, and whatever. So basically improving the existing experience we have from LTE. The second one is the massive mTC, where it sounds a little bit like an evolution of narrowband IoT. And I would say probably the biggest issue is that we want to have even higher device density than what we have actually designed narrowband IoT for. But I think personally what I find really interesting is this ultra-reliable low latency communication, where we are targeting for a latency of less than 1 millisecond. It should be ultra reliable, so an outage of less than 10 to the minus 5. Whereas normally when we look into outages for mobile networks, we're typically looking into 5% outage or whatever. So this is a completely different magnitude of outage we're looking into. And the last one is that we don't accept any gaps during mobility. So in LTE, for example, when we're doing handover, we actually don't have any service during the period of handover. So for 5G, we demand zero mobility interruption. So that's also a pretty new target we are having. So I will, in this presentation, mainly look into, let's say, the massive MTC and the ultra-reliable low-latency communication. And that's actually all for this IoT connectivity. And then I think I have to congratulate you, Jens, about your timing of this event. So if we look into the Gartner's hype curve, we have actually IoT and autonomous vehicles exactly at the peak of the hype. So next year, it could have been too late to have this event. You're exactly on the spot of the peak. It's August, but if you have had, let's say, your previous event could not have had it, that would have been too early, and the next one will actually be too late. So Gartner have not made the new contribution for 2016. It's also interesting to see, we've been talking a lot about IoT platforms, so this is actually one of the upcoming technologies. It has not reached the top yet, but it will probably in 1 or 2 years' time, it will actually come to the peak. What is a little bit depressing from our side that 5G is not even mentioned in this graph. So Gartner even don't recognize 5G to one of the enabling technologies. I think this is disappointing, isn't it? But anyway, from all the 5G hype, we actually started a standardization of probably what we call 5G in 3GPP. There was a study item approved called New Radio. In March, there was more than 40 companies behind this. And I just took the front page of the recent Signals Ahead magazine. And it's a little bit interesting that after we have spent 5 years of all the hype about 5G, when we finally start a study item, we just call it something as boring as New Radio. And then the question is, this new radio, is that actually equal to 5G? And I had the pleasure to chair a panel session at a similar event in Brooklyn in last month. And there was like a general consensus that 5G RAD is actually more than the new radio. And there was also consensus that LTE evolution should be part of our 5G story. So new radio is not equal to 5G, I should say. So what is this new radio about? It's about the three use cases I just mentioned: the enhanced mobile broadband, the massive mMTC, ultra reliable, and then there's a large range of requirements. So frequency range should support from below 1 gigahertz and up to 100 gigahertz, and so forth. I think the other thing I want to mention, let's say, this standardization have started with a big bang. So even in the first RAN 1 meeting last month, there was more than 200 contributions. So it really started like this. It's not like TCP slow start or whatever. We actually start extremely fast. Then if I look into the timing for this, for the moment we have, let's say, the study item, which are supposed to finalize by middle of 2017. And then it's expected like that 5G will be divided into two phases. We'll have a first phase, which should be ready by June 2018. And then we'll have a second phase, which should be completed by December 2019. And without doing any speculation or whatever, one can somewhat correlate these dates with a Winter Olympic event in Korea in 2018 and a Summer Olympic event in Japan in 2020. So there are some correlation with other things than technology. Then if I look into the really dirty details of, let's say, this new radio and the requirement. So there's like drafted a new requirement document for new radio. And what we see is that we are actually having lots of the same KPIs as we had for LTE. So it's about the peak data rate, it's about the spectral efficiency. But there are also some new KPIs which are actually related to the IoT domain. So control plane latency is reduced to less than 10 milliseconds as a requirement. User plane latency, and it's one way, is actually less than a half millisecond. It's actually pretty low. Mobility interruption is below 0 milliseconds. We have this reliability of 10 to the minus 5 within 1 millisecond. We have the maximum coupling loss for the narrowband IoT type of cases of 164 dB. And now battery lifetime have actually gone to 15 years and not only the 10 years. Device density, more than 1 million devices per square kilometer. That's basically the target. And you can start to calculate if they're just a little bit of active and whatever, it's a hell lot of devices we need to support per cell. But that's basically the numbers as they stand today. So now I look a little bit more into the details of massive mTC optimization going from narrowband IoT to 5G. Yeah. So the previous speaker, Laurie, was speaking about narrowband IoT. And it's actually kind of interesting. So I have been in the radio domain for almost 25 years. And my task has always been to improve the peak data rate. So once and the first time in my career and whatever, it's like going in exactly the opposite direction. So the exercise has actually been about removing complexity. So what we have done is that we have reduced the bandwidth from 10 megahertz to only 200 kilohertz. We have actually removed the duplexing capability from full duplex to half duplex. We have removed one antenna from 2 to 1 and so forth. And then we have introduced a lot of repetition. And by doing this, we can actually gain like almost 24 dB in link budget, and at the same time, we have been able to reduce the modem complexity to less than 15% of a normal LTE modem. So I would say it's a lot about just taking complexity away. So we did some practical studies on what does these additional 24 dB actually give us in practice. So we did a study in a rural area of Denmark where we have actually been looking into an LTE 800 network and see how much do we actually improve in coverage probability from going from LTE and to narrowband IoT. So if I take LTE coverage, we only have 4% outage area coverage outdoor. If I go indoor, I'll actually have more than 50% outage in this network. Whereas if I go to the narrowband IoT with the additional link budget, I will actually have 0% indoor outage at ground level. But if I want to cover underground, I may actually still have like 25% outage. So it's like, yes, the additional 25 dB gain me a lot, but if I want to go downstairs in rural areas, I may still have a problem. So I need either indoor solutions or I actually need to install more base stations. We also did some measurements in like a rural area, and here we actually want to see for the automotive use case, how far underground can we actually go with narrowband IoT. The good thing is, a little bit like Laurie was showing in her presentation, that everything going to, let's say, one level down, we can fully cover in urban areas by narrowband IoT. Even the second floor underground, with high probability, we can cover. But if we start to go to -3rd or -4th floor, we actually need dedicated solutions, even indoor, to reach these meters way deep downstairs. So we gain a lot from the 24 dB, but it's not like it's solving everything. Then coming to the technologies for this 5G massive MTC, I showed some of the requirements. I also have some suggestions for solutions, but I'll not go into the details because it doesn't make any sense to say what are the solutions as basic the study item have just started. But I would say from a technology point of view, we have a lot of technologies where we believe we can improve and how we can reach the targets for 5G. So the more interesting one is then probably this missing critical communication from LTE Pro to this ultra-reliable low latency communication in 5G. And here we should not remember or not forget that we have actually made a lot of advancements since release 8 and until the coming release 13. So I would say that all our visions should not wait until we have new radio. A lot of our visions should actually start with LTE evolution. And I think if we just make some bold statements, basically in all domains, we have been able to improve LTE by a factor of 10 since we actually introduced LTE in release 8. And I just introduced the massive IoT, but we have also introduced critical communication as public safety and V2X in LTE. So if we take, let's say, the current working item in LTE about V2X, we are actually looking into two different scenarios for this. The first one is this direct V2V, where the car can actually broadcast information to the adjacent cars. And the nice thing about this is that latency can be extremely small, but the drawback is that reliability is relatively poor, except I put in brackets platooning. And the reason is, if this car is having an accident, but there's no cars around, I mean, who should it broadcast to? right? There's nobody to receive this, and it might be these cars are coming later. So I could have informed these cars much earlier than it came into the local vicinity by using a network solution where the car will actually send information to the network, and the network will actually broadcast to the relevant users. This solution, on the other hand, typically have higher latency, but much higher reliability. But we're looking into both options for this V2X. Then about latency, we did a lot of measurements. So we have been driving more than 10,000 kilometers in the north of Jutland to investigate basically what is the current network performance. In this one slide, I specifically look into latency, and I think that it was mentioned earlier that ping times down to like 15 milliseconds is possible in LTE. In Denmark, I have to say the minimum we measured were like 20 milliseconds. It's pretty close. And some operators have pretty steep curves. So if I take one of the LTE operators, even at the 90% level, I'm much below 50 milliseconds. But you can also see there is a very, very small tail up here. And that is typically when the UE will go to handover. So during handover, I don't have any service availability. So this is what we should be remembering. If I want to rely on the service, I should also include the handover gap I may have in LTE. It's also interesting to see that, say, how the performance can differ between three operators. It's basically the same technology they are introducing. So one operator have like, let's say at the 95% level, 40 millisecond delay, whereas an operator have 100 millisecond delay. It's also interesting to see that one operator have exactly the same delay in the LTE network as they have in the 3G network. So I think this is like an indication. It's not only about, let's say, how we specify the system. It's a lot about how we deploy the systems, what performance we'll get out. So how do we then get down to this 0.5 millisecond latency, and specifically for TDD mode? And I would say we can do it, but it's a challenge. So the first thing we have to do is we need to reduce the TTI from 1 millisecond as we have in LTE and go down to like 1/8 of this, so 0.125 millisecond. At the same time, the processing delay we're having in the devices and the base stations need to go down almost by the same factor. And even though in a TDD system, it's actually difficult to get much less than the 1 millisecond. So a factor of 2 worse than what is actually the target. That's for a schedule system. So one of the tricks we can actually introduce in 5G is that we can actually go back to what we call semi-persistent scheduling. So it's a little bit like what Jens introduced. We're basically going back to the old telephony system where we have a dedicated channel to each one of the users. So this seems like that it may actually become a reality, Jens, to reach this. So this is how, yes, we can get the 0.5 millisecond, and it's going to have a cost in complexity. And this semi-persistent location have another benefit, because if you want to have this reliability of 10 to the -5, the problem is not only that, say, the error probability of the user plane data. If we have a scheduled system, the UE will only decode the user plane data if it's actually receiving and decoding the scheduling grant correctly. So we actually have multiple error sources to get the 10 to the -5. So if we use semi-persistent allocation, we can actually get rid of one of the terms in this error probability. Again, I think from a technology point of view, yes, we can do it. absolutely no problem. It's only a matter of cost. But I think there's some trade-offs I want to highlight, that if we want to have this less than 1 millisecond latency, it's certainly going to reduce the coverage we're having compared to current LTE. So this is actually one of the payments we're going to make. So either, if you want to have it as wide area, operators need to invest a lot in the network, or we have to accept it's actually only something we have within limited islands, this low latency. I think the other aspects I want to highlight, the connection density. So if we want to have this again less than 1 millisecond with this high reliability, it's basically almost like an unloaded system. So the connection density for this kind of service cannot be extremely high. Last one is mobility. Do we need to support this kind of service up to 500 kilometers per hour, or can we actually do with less? That's also a question mark. So I think with this, I will go to my last slides, and I thought, what should I actually conclude based on this stuff? So I jumped to something different. We are at the right time for Internet of Things. But then I also took a look into what has happened with other technologies which have been at this sweet spot and actually been falling down. And I'm so old that I don't remember how teenage sex was. But there was a big statement in 2013 that big data is like teenage sex. Everyone talks about it. Nobody really knows how to do it. Everyone thinks everyone else is doing it. So everyone claims they are doing it. This was like a big saying. And then I was like looking into what has happened with, let's say, the other hype areas. So even in 2016, so this year, there was exactly the same quote, why autonomous vehicle is like teenage sex and whatever. So this is up. And my forecast is probably in 2017, unless the industry do extremely well, we will probably have the next quote, IoT is probably like teenage sex and whatever. So that ends my presentation. Thank you.
Much, Preben. Please, let's see if we have a question. So, Jens?
So everybody talks about propagation measurements, so that's also interesting. I think an interesting, if you can comment a little bit more about the measurements you did indoors.
Yep.
Because I think that is quite interesting, because it's a quite different story. We heard yesterday that, I mean, if you have a mobile environment or a smartphone environment, people walk around all the time. So if you're not covered in 1 second and you move 20 centimeters to the side, then you're in, it's okay. So 99% is or 98% is very good. But we heard yesterday that the IoT sensor has to be put right here.
Right.
And it doesn't move. You can't sort of find a good position where you put it. It has to be right here. So, and how did you do the? You mentioned the worst case. How did you find the worst place?
We didn't find the worst place as such. So what we did was we basically got the complete, let's say, site database from one of the operators in Denmark. And then basically we calculated the link budget to each one of the points in a coverage map. And this gave us, like, if we put a limit of 140 dB, this gave us like this outage. And then we were like adding 10 or 20 dB of additional outdoor to indoor penetration loss. And if it was underground, we even added yet another 10 dB. And these numbers are based on some other measurements we have done that we believe these are like realistic numbers to put in. And then we get like indoor basement, let's say on ground floor, we don't actually exceed the link budget limit. Whereas if you start to go underground with a certain probability, we do actually exceed.
I think there's still some work to be done. How to model sort of the indoor scenarios there,
Exactly.
because I think that is. I don't think it's quite well understood, because you always believe that. Also, the signal processing, if you do repetition coding, for instance, that works great if you're moving, because
Right.
If you're in the next transmission, you're in the right place, then everything is fine. But if you're in the wrong spot forever, then it doesn't matter how many times
Keep on
you
being
repeat.
the wrong spot. Yeah. Exactly.
Mm-hmm.
Exactly. And I think this is the reason why, in principle, we guess we need to be close to 0% in outage level. Yeah.
So I think we hold the further questions to the panel. So thank you very much.